Afternoon, everyone, and a very warm welcome to this FETL-sponsored webinar, Informing the Future, the Leadership of Thinking. Thank you so much for joining us. Delighted to be joined by some fantastic speakers today and colleagues from around the world. We have people from as far as New Zealand, Canada, Ireland, Singapore. Maybe you could use the chat facility and just tell us, where in the world are you? Perhaps your nearest town or your nearest city, but a very warm welcome. We want to begin this webinar by just very briefly saying that our hearts and support go out to the people of India. We have some colleagues from India on this webinar, and really just to say that we are thinking of you all, and we really hope and pray for a better future with the COVID crisis. We're thinking of you. We have people from different backgrounds as well as people from all around the world. I'm seeing in front of me, hello, says Helen from London. And I'm also thinking that we will have people here perhaps from other sectors other than further education. And this webinar is a broad church embracing further education and all matters really in that corridor between further education, skills in its widest sense. So great to see you all, great to see you all busy in the chat. Just a couple of ground rules to begin with. And when you're not speaking, please do switch off your mic and do keep your camera switched off unless you are speaking, as this helps with the quality of the online experience. And also you'll see at the bottom there's a Q&A facility. So as we go along, this is a unique webinar where we're going to have conversations, to and fro conversations, and then you'll get a chance to ask any questions as well. Put them in the Q&A if they're precise questions. And if you just want to reflect and you're into active learning and you want to share, just put it in the chat. We welcome all of that. So let's just very quickly move on to the next slide, just so that we can be clear about the purpose of this. Together, we're going to focus on the leadership of thinking and what it really means in a rapidly changing education and employment landscape. I'm not going to read out all of this because you would have read it whenever you registered. So let's just very quickly say that we hope that in the hour that you have with us, that you get some space to think, and no idea is a silly idea. Ask any question and share any points of reflection. So who are our speakers? Well, you can see their lovely images in front of you there. As I say, we have an audience from the UK and indeed from British Columbia, Canada. Chris has got up at 7:30 maybe in the morning now, so a big round of applause to Chris for that very early start. So these are our lineup, our fine lineup of speakers. And let's just put a little bit of context before we start by a conversation between me and Dame Ruth Silver, DBE, of which I'll say a few words in a minute. So context is always really, really important. And this image, if we just look at the next slide, this image of riding the waves is how the metaphor that I use for me personally during lockdown and then the aftermath here of lockdown being released is that everything feels like there's risk, there's uncertainty, there's change, and there's challenge. And if you're a practitioner, perhaps you might think, well, actually, what has leadership got to do with me? Well, by the end of this session, I hope that we will have persuaded you that leadership, the thinking of leadership, is something that involves all of us, and it's wrapped up in risk, uncertainty, change, and challenge. So what we'd like to do now is to invite you to just respond to a short poll. So if Mark would just share the poll, we're going to ask you one key question. And again, no right or wrong answers. Please just tell us from your perspective, when you think about informing the future and the leadership of thinking, how easy is it to lead from the trenches? So please just fill out our poll and tell us whether you think it's very easy, whether it's easy, difficult, very difficult, or maybe you're just not sure. We're just interested to see as a collective of, you know, many people, what the mood is around how easy is it to lead from the trenches. And Mark will perhaps share with us the results of that poll in just a few minutes. Ruth, I'm going to quickly say hello to you. I'll do a formal introduction, but if you had to answer this, what would you say? How easy is it to lead from the trenches? I'm putting you on the spot here.
No, I mean, I was thinking I'd actually answered easy to this, and let me explain why. I think I learned more from people who were doing the actual job and could come, depending on how they came about it, but actually were able to come and saying, how about this, and I'm finding that. And so, like Fettel, who learned from the sector how to be a think tank, I think I learned to be a principal from folk who are actually there saying there's a bit more of this and a bit less of that. Now, I'm not being trite about that. You know, you have they both depend on certain decorum. So a listening principle with members of staff who are confident in their role and confident about being heard. But I can see the reason for all the other categories, Deirdre. It's all very tricky stuff. But, yeah. But a good professional will stop you in the corner and talk and work through different ways of doing that.
Interesting. You know, we've all got our own different perceptions, haven't we? So let's get into conversation, and I will do a proper introduction now of Dame Ruth Silver, DBE. She's the founding president of the Further Education Trust for Leadership, indeed the main sponsor for today's event. Fettel is an independent think tank set up 7.5 years ago, focusing on the leadership of thinking in and about further education and the skills system, which is why it's so terrific that we've got people in the skills system in the broadest sense here. Now, for 17 years, Ruth was principal of Lewisham College in London, a large vocational further education college, serving a diverse and multicultural population, offering inspiring and challenging courses with widening access in education. And not just in education, but onwards in economic life. I could say so much more about Ruth because she has so many achievements in her career to date and will continue to have many achievements. So let me begin now with a conversation with Ruth. And perhaps, Mark, you could just sort of share that slide as we begin. So, Ruth, I want to begin this webinar by asking some key questions. And the first question, I think, for our colleagues outside of the UK in particular, tell us briefly about Fettel.
Before I do that, can I just take the chance to pay tribute to the 650 people at Lewisham College who helped with all the things you've talked about, Deirdre. And I meant it. You know, actually, I learned more from below than from many other parts of the system. And actually, I think that's probably true of my life. So let me put myself in my place. So the Further Education Trust for Leadership, it is the only independent think tank that the sector's ever had. We've had some good development bodies and improvement bodies, but this was something different. And I think that it was very clear that we benefited from the context we were in. So Fettel rose from the ashes of another organisation, an improvement body, not a think tank, called ELSIS, the Learning Skills Improvement Service. And that itself had been the recipient of all the work and some funding from other improvement bodies. So change of government, change of ways of working, things started to close down, and we became the last organisation standing. And the government then wrote to us, some people know about this, and said, actually, we are no longer funding you. Not that we're closing you down, very clever government, but they said, we're no longer funding you. So we did what we had to do, finished the projects, returned funds to the government, and found that we had monies left from 3 of the improvement bodies who'd closed down. And those monies were for the 4 nations in the United Kingdom. And so we couldn't just return it to the English government. We have devolved nations to different extents. So the lawyers advised the board about, alternatives, and I was sent off by the board to say, what else can you do? And I had done some concept papers for the board, and what came up was this notion of a think tank, an independent think tank serving our own professionals. So I took that out to the world, and with the exception of one party in the system, people thought it was a good idea. And, with that encouragement, the board took the decision to set up an independent think tank with a limited timescale. They didn't want to raise funds. So we set up and we had a plan to be there for 5 years. We had assistance from great lawyers, great auditors, and a new board of very, very courageous people, very independent-minded people as well. So we then started. I don't know if you want to know about the initial phases, but
yeah. Well, what we can do is we can sort of, towards the end of our conversation, we'll have a little look at some of Vettel's achievements. I've got a slide there that we can share with the audience. Ruth, our audience, are from these sort of further education skills and careers corridors, really, that exist between and within education and employment. And you've talked before about this idea of leaderhood. Tell us more about that, because, what does leaderhood mean, and how can we, as individuals, sort of drive that forward?
Well, I think the learning, actually my own learning as a principal and an ex-civil servant and so on, had been actually there's only so much you can do with an institution. And actually what further education had to fight long and hard to get round many tables, so that the changes that we were working on connected in some way with universities, with employers, with schools. And actually Vettel worked with 2 concepts: the leader in the system and the system in the leader. So the institution and the individual. And of course, when you think in systems terms, leadership is much too selfish, much too narrow. So if you think of the system that's FE, that's education, with FE and skills around there, you have to work with partners. You have to work, not with the slice of bread you're given, but actually with the whole loaf, if you'll forgive that phrase. So that we all share one task, which is the thriving of our people. And rather than saying, well, this is my bit and I'll do that and I'll account for that. And also knocking on doors of people who should know better, who wouldn't let us in. Mm-hmm. So it was that really, saying actually leadership is inadequate these days in a context when education is much more systemic, and FE and skills goes across the boundaries of employer and actually building ladders down into the community, into schools. So leaderhood for me meant very simply, we've all got one task, which is to help our people thrive, to do that and not our own idiosyncratic meaning. And in order to do that, actually you work as a team, leadership team. Leaderhood is about fatherhood and motherhood, because you do the job you do, you're part of that hood. And not sectarian or sectorian about it. Actually, some of the hardest battles we had was to get in with our local education department and our local schools. Our colleagues in colleges, we experienced that notion of this is my territory, that's your territory. That's helped by the overall system, whereby universities have a different system in accounting and funding as do schools. So that notion of breaking that down, can we put all our purses together and just do the one thing? And that's what I mean by leaderhood, when you're not just looking up for your own domain.
I love that sense of brotherhood, sisterhood, motherhood, leaderhood. It speaks, I think, certainly to all of us. I think the other question, Ruth, and I wanted to ask you, and then we'll come back in conversation at the end, is about why leadership of thinking? Why have we got leadership of thinking?
Well, actually, it was just a phrase that came to mind, like leaderhood did. And actually, it's been quite awkward, quite helpfully awkward, because people start talking about thinking about leadership. Now, that's not what Fettel did. Fettel did not want to do that. And we've been described as thought leaders. What we wanted to do was, and not Fettel to do it, but to enable people to think. That we had the habits of being told what to do by government or partners for their interests, for a certain amount of money and so on. And I was always curious, because I had fabulous boards of governors. You know, they were just horrific, who would be interested in an idea, creative idea and challenge. So the leadership of thinking was saying, we're not a do tank. I think we've been treated by do tanks in the past. We're a think tank. And that means we think about what we do. And in order to think about what we do, we need concepts. We need to discuss those. So that's really how it started. And what we did was Fettel didn't do the writing and the thinking. We did some, but not really. We asked other people to, I remember phoning up and saying, what's in your mind? Do you want to write about it? Actually, to give them the chance. We made some big mistakes, by the way, but actually I knew that they knew more than the people who were telling us what to do.
Fantastic.
They were absolutely there, and they had the wisdom of praxis. So it was thinking by go away and write about it, go do a study, go commission something, and boy, you know, was it created? We had some fabulous colleagues who said, "Okay, I'll have a go," and they did.
Well, let's have a look at the next slide, just to give our audience just a sense of a few of your selected articles and publications. And just while Mark is doing that, I just wanted to share this with you as an audience, because when you have a look at slide number 6 here, that's it. When you look at some of these titles in this slide, and apologies if you can't read them so well, but really just some of these titles, you know, a framework for leading in further education and skills 2021, letting the light in, no strings attached, some of the issues to do with shame and loss in further education. So if as an attendee here, you're not from the further education sector, but you're from others, I think we can learn a lot from these publications around thinking outside of the box. And I think it's on that tone I want to thank Ruth. We'll come back again and have further conversation shortly. But I'd now like to introduce our next speaker, Pat Carvalho. And Pat is a deputy CEO at Harrow College. She's principal of the college, and she has been since August 2017. Pat, a very, very warm welcome to you. Thank you so much in your very busy schedule, sharing your own thoughts and ideas today. Prior to you being at Harrow College since 2009, first as a vice principal and then as a principal, you started off as a medical secretary before going to university. And as a mature student, you majored in philosophy and then artificial intelligence. I imagine your careers advisor sitting down with you when you were younger, asking you what you might want to do when you were older. Certainly 30 years on in the further education sector, you know, you're so committed to lifelong learning. So tell us just a little bit, I've given a potted history there. Tell us a little bit, Pat, about your career and experience in particular of further education and leadership.
I suppose really, I mean, I do have to kind of start when I was 16, because that is my first experience of FE. I chose to go to a further education college, you know, unbeknownst to my parents, who thought I was going to go and do A-levels, and wanted to be a medical secretary. That was my choice. That was my first career, and I was successful in it. And, you know, it was FE again when I realised it wasn't the be and end all of life and the learning I wanted to continue to do and how I wanted to grow, that I chose to go back to FE. And for me, I've always understood it to be there to support us through all the different chops and changes that we want to take through our lives. And that's how it's worked for me. And so I had an opportunity, and luckily there were people who inspired me to kind of push myself and to, you know, eventually get to university as a mature student. And it kind of took off from there. You know, I could have gone into industry, but again, you know, I was working in the NHS, the National Health Service for, you know, for those 6 years. I wanted to be back in public service. That's where I wanted to be. And so I chose education. And I chose FE because I understood FE. I knew what it did for me, and I wanted to do the same for everyone else. So that was, you know, that was that journey. But in terms of as a leader, you know, I've always kind of seized the opportunities, and luckily I've always put myself into a position where I could take up opportunities. I like to do different things. I wanted to make things that actually really helped our students. That wasn't hindering our students, because, you know, even though I talk positively about FE, I can assure you I had negative and positive experiences in my time. And I wanted to make sure that, you know, when we had students in front of us, we were giving them the best opportunities. And that has always driven me, you know, so, you know, how I've, I suppose, really led others as developed myself. It's always been at the back. And I've been, you know, lucky enough just working really in 2 organisations. I was 3 since 2017, but in the main 2 organisations to really hone in and develop myself. You know, which I think is not an unusual story in FE. There's a lot of us that stay with an institution for a long time, and we do that because of the culture, because of the difference that we're making, and you know, and that real sense of you know, of achieving something and seeing year in, year out, you know, students really, you know, really taking themselves forward, and you do that, you know, not by chopping and changing. You know, I was never a career, you know, opportunist in that, you know, that way. I thought about myself, you know, where I was. But that was just, you know, that was just me. And
yeah. Well, it sounds like, you know, that sort of honing your skills in a particular environment, and that giving something back. Now, Pat, you know that, you know, across the globe, there's been so much happening, you know, beyond COVID, the Black Lives Matters, and, you know, some shocking statistics around the lack of diversity, not just in FE, in the careers sector, and indeed in other parts of the education system. So how do we improve diversity and inclusion when it comes to thinking about leadership?
I think in terms of the FE sector, I think all FE colleges really need to reflect their local communities. I think it's really important, and they're reflecting those local communities, but they also need to reflect the students who come to their institutions, because they're not necessarily the same thing. You know, particularly if I take London, you know, students travel to go to particular, you know, colleges outside of where they live. And they do that for you know, for particular reasons. And I think, you know, you need to have that in mind when you're thinking about, you know, being, you know, how inclusive you are, who your learners really are, and understanding where they're coming from. And I think we need to review, you know, what we do for our students across the whole of the you know, the student journey, right from the time that, you know, they inquire with us to the time that, you know, to their destination. And I think that's, the destination is probably the most important part for them. As you know, when they're leaving us, as to what have we done to help them get to that point, but actually what are we doing that's enabling them to really make those steps, you know, beyond the college, are so critical. And that's not necessarily about conversations just with our students, and, you know, and the learning and you know, that we, and the support that we should be giving them.
Yeah, I think it's a tough one. It's like a wicked question, you know, that I think we all need to ask ourselves around how do we improve diversity and inclusion. And I suppose that leadership in thinking, you know, do you think we think about it enough, and, you know, what actions should we take as individuals to help address that diversity?
I mean, I think for people in my position as a senior leader in, you know, in college, it's got to be almost a another look, a root and branch look at what we're doing. I think it has to be, you know, almost that a very kind of systematic approach, and actually using their lens to actually look at what we do. You know, because it's not to say that there aren't things, you know, in the FE sector that we do really well and students will be appreciative of. But I think when you choose to through somebody else's eyes, you actually see things that actually you didn't realise. You know, and you need to be able to do that. So I really do think that's quite an important part of, you know, what we need to, you know, engage in. On a personal level, I think you can only do this by, you know, understanding your own prejudices, and we all have our own prejudices, no matter what we say, you know, and it's about wanting to improve and having that, you know, wanting to make sure that we're looking at ourselves and asking questions, really hard questions of ourselves. You know, are we, you know, or are our actions, for example, racist? And not to be afraid about that. It's not about saying that we are or anything. It's about trying to get to a solution. It's about getting to a better place, and not to be afraid about that. And I think that's a really important thing. I think bravery, you know, is a real important part of what we need to do. You know, being brave as senior leaders, and I think for all staff, and I think, you know, staff in, you know, and managers in the middle, you know, leaders in the trenches, you know, probably find that even harder because of all the other things that they have to, you know, battle with as well. And it's having the time and the space to really reflect on those things and to make those practical changes, you know, that students and other staff can see.
Interesting, Pat, because I know that you're going to have to leave us early. There's a question here which says, it's from Rebecca, and she says, do you think we should be more considerate of lived experiences of a diverse range of leaders to better understand how to improve diversity? For example, are there barriers we are not seeing that impact on individuals seeking to progress to leadership roles that we could address? It's quite a long question, but
I agree with the first part wholeheartedly. I think absolutely you do need to take on board the lived experience of individuals, of any individual, you know, somebody, you know, as a staff member, or indeed our students. I think you have to do that. You need to be listening to those views. I think in terms of, you know, what we can do to, you know, to support people is to ensure that we're setting up senior leaders the right environments for them to be able to say this is my experience, and not to feel that it's going to be pushed aside. It's not going to be taken on face value.
sure.
Value, and
It's really important to create those conditions,
you know, without it being something, oh my gosh, you know, what are they saying, you know, do we need to tone that down, do we need whatever, just take it on value and work through it.
Fantastic.
To feel that they can be part of, and should be part of, you know, that solution, you know, that goes forward.
That's great, Pat, and it's a wonderful segue actually to our next speaker, who's going to focus on harnessing perspective and thinking about our emotions. I just want to remind our audience, please do use that Q&A. I will give you a chance to come in. Hopefully at the end you can put your hand up and come in, but we do want to get any questions that you have. And thank you very much, Pat, for taking that very first question from our audience.
Thank you.
Thank you. So it now gives me wonderful pleasure to introduce our third speaker. I feel we're on a roll here. Our third speaker is Professor Chris Magnussen, who has just completed, I'll call it a stint, as Dean of Faculty of Education at Simon Fraser University in British Columbia. In August, he returned to faculty life as a professor. Again, he's had many, many roles you'll have seen on our website, so I'm not going to read all of it. He would blush, I think, anyway. But he's a recipient of the Province of Alberta Career Development Award of Excellence. Doesn't get much better than that. And the 2006 recipient of the Stu Conger Award for Leadership and Career Development. And Chris and I go back a long way, where we were both had that curiosity about evidence-based and impact. So I'm delighted that Chris is able to join us today. And we've got some slides which Mark will share. And really just to say that Chris has recently written a book called Career Helping, Harnessing Perspective and Emotion in Everyday Practice. So for the next 10 minutes, Chris is going to just walk us through his thoughts. And again, hopefully you may have some questions, or feel free to chat in the chat box. I'm not the bot, the chat box. So I think we want to go back just to Chris, you've got your slides, so over to you.
Well, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I'm speaking to you today from the traditional and unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples of the Musqueam, the Squamish, the Tsleil-Waututh, and the Coquitlam nations. And as Deirdre said, I'd like to give you a snapshot of the important roles that perspective and emotion play in our leadership attempts. And I'll be speaking mostly to the career practitioners out there, but I'm going to start in perhaps a bit of an odd place. You may or may not know that Canada has a rather tragic and awful history of our relations with our First Nations people. And in the late 1880s, the Indian Act was passed, and that led to the formalization of the residential school system, which in effect took children from their parents from the ages of about 5 to usually about the age of 16. And they lived in residential schools. They were not allowed to speak their language. They were not allowed to embrace any elements of their culture. And it was a process of an attempted assimilation into the broader, largely white society. And it led to generational trauma. And so the Canadian government started what they called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, giving people an opportunity to tell their stories and their truth to the world, to bring us towards a status of reconciliation. At our university, in response to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the president established a council to say, what could this university do to move us towards a better path of reconciliation? And how might we address those specific calls? We met as in our external communities as well as our internal communities for over 15 months. And we concluded with this beautiful document you see, Walk This Path With Us. And we identified 34 specific calls to action, which are currently in various stages of implementation. But the thing is, the whole process almost collapsed before it got going. When I started my address, I gave what we call a territorial acknowledgement. And part of the reconciliation process is that the settler community acknowledges and recognizes the original lands upon which they are privileged to live and work. When we started this process, we thought we were moving towards building a preferred future, a good career term, a preferred future for reconciliation at SFU. And in the first meeting, the first open forum we had, there was person after person lined up to tell their story. And we did not want to repeat the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We wanted to move forward. And so we addressed that as co-chair at our second community forum. And a lady gave us a beautiful gift. And she said, it's fine to acknowledge the territorial relationship, but you need to acknowledge the emotional terrain that many of us are trying to navigate. And we can't think about this preferred future because there's so much going on. But if you simply acknowledge it, we can move forward. And when we did that, just the simple acknowledgement of the difficult emotional terrain that we were in, people were able to park their emotion, long enough to think about creating a preferred future. I think there's a lot of our career practice that is very similar to that. Whenever somebody presents to us with that idea of what shall I do with my future, I believe that we have been hamstrung by relying way too much on information. It's as if we believe that if you're in a situation where you're trying to plan for a future, all we got to do is pour more data into your head. So let's invest in labor market information, and let's invest in understanding about yourself. So the thinking is that people facing these decisions are often just lacking information, and that is almost never the case. Now, caveat, information is a good thing, but it needs to be timely, accurate, and linked to the person's need. But the assumption that we tend to make as career practitioners or career influencers is that working with emotions is outside of our scope of practice. And I'd like to kind of turn that idea on its head. In fact, if I could, I'd like to just get rid of it altogether and instead replace it with the idea that working with emotion is not only within our career practitioner's scope of practice, but it is our ethical obligation to do so. Because here's the problem. Information itself is neutral, but perceptions and dig deeper, these underlying beliefs that people hold and their emotional attachments distort information that comes forward. John Crumboltz used to talk about self-observation generalizations and worldview generalizations, things that we deeply hold to be true about ourselves and things we deeply hold to be true about the world around us. These are the anchors that clients come to us with. And these anchors always come with an emotional attachment. So they're inextricably linked. And we can't possibly help people plan for a future unless we understand these two powerful dynamics. And I think of this meme that I'm sure you've seen as you've been scurrying about the internet. We tend to believe that if we give and provide accurate information, we level the playing field and that our clients and those that we're working with have a shared meaning. And it is almost never the case. We tend to see things in terms of possibility, and they often see things in terms of systemic racism or systemic barriers or economic issues that they're facing with or self-doubts that they have. Visibility is not the same as shared meaning. Now, I'm going to give you one quick example of that, and I know you've seen this before, the classic old lady, young lady picture. You may not know how you see what you see. If you have a tendency to first look at the top half of the picture, you're likely to see the profile of the young woman looking over to the right. And then when you take in the rest of the information, you make the rest of the data consistent with your first belief. So you'll see a jawline, you'll see a choker, a red choker collar, and a scoop neck blouse. But if for whatever reason your attention was first drawn to the lower part of the picture, you're more likely to see a rather large nose, lips pursed together, and a chin tucked into a fur coat. And then when you complete the picture, you tend to see an older woman. And that brings me to one of the 5 critical perception issues that I think get in the way and that we have to be aware of when we're trying to help others. And that's simply jumping to conclusion. So because we have an orienting perspective, we set up an expectation of what we're going to see, and then we take in all the new data, all the information in such a way that it confirms that initial perspective. It very rarely allows it to dispute the perspective. The natural tendency, it's not a willing thing, the natural tendency is to take information and make it consistent with what you already believe. Those we call schema, and we'd go nuts if we didn't have schema. We organize information into patterns so we can routinize things, and that helps us to become much more efficient. But there's a problem with this efficiency, and that is that the more efficient we get, the less information we need before we make a judgment. And furthermore, the more deeply rooted our schema, the less likely we are to see any alternative meanings. And the best example I can possibly think of is this character. In the US, fully 50% of the people would see this and see the savior of the American way of life. And the other 50% would see the destroyer of the American way of life. And neither side can fathom how the other side ignores all the data to the contrary. And it's just completely understandable how somebody could believe something different. Now, the second major linkage here is the problem of emotion and the emotional attachments. And I love this quote from Daniel Gilbert. Our business is creating preferred futures for others. Well, we can't possibly feel good about an imaginary future when we're feeling bad about an actual present. So this emotional filter that happens on a temporal level. You came in and you're feeling frustrated because it was tough to get into your appointment, but it also happens on a much more a much more developmental level. The Manager Foundation identified changes in morale as a result of entering an environment. And people who enter into an environment go through a rather predictable sequence of emotions. And if you enter an environment by choice, you tend to start with apprehension. Think of when you were admitted to school, to post-secondary, or think of when you started a new job. There was apprehension there, but it was positive. But then we go through this cycle of enthusiasm through anxiety, disappointment, frustration, and ultimately into a period of depression. And if you enter this cycle not by choice, such as you lost your job or you're being forced to change, then you tend to end with anxiety or disappointment. So the most important thing here is to recognize that whatever stage of change you're at, you're interpreting all information through this lens of the emotion that is present. When you're enthusiastic, everything looks great. When you're depressed, nothing looks good. So 3 quick suggestions for practice. The most obvious one, number 1, acknowledge the emotion that's present. You can reflect it if you can see it. If you don't see it, ask about it, explore the impact it's had, attempt to normalize it by showing how other people go through it, and where possible, harness positive emotion. And as an example of good leadership, when Deirdre opened the session, she acknowledged the emotional space of the suffering that's going on in India right now. And that acknowledgement doesn't take the emotion away, but it allows people to park it long enough to think. The second thing is to simply use some form of reframing. So the first one's an emotional intervention. The second one is a cognitive intervention. So you take the same information and you reframe it. I was working with a 28-year-old woman who had this dream of becoming a teacher, but it would take her 5 years to get there, and it was far too long because she was sole support for her 2 children. The reframing, well, how old will you be in 5 years if you don't go back to school? Oh, it's the same. You have a huge unemployment rate and people are frustrated by it. The task now is to how to become one of the 88% employed and not one of the 12% unemployed. Oh, that gives a different perspective. And remind people that every decision is a career decision, and a career planning is really about setting and exploring directions, not fixating on destinations. And the third quick one, because the most critical factor in successful career development is sustaining momentum, then find a way to get the client to take a next step. Get them moving, because you can make small nudges to a moving body far easier than you can get something started in the first place. And that's the cover of the book that Deirdre was talking about. And I think I'm well over my time.
Thank you. No, you've been fantastic. Fantastic, Chris. And I can see in the chat there's a few questions, but we're going to save that to the end. I'm now going to introduce our next speaker, Sue Pember. Sue and I go back a long way. In fact, Sue was one of the senior civil servants who appointed me as chair of the National Careers Council. So thank you for that, Sue. It was a really great experience. Because of time, I won't read all of your biography, but you know, you started off as a teacher, and you're one of the very few people who've been in further education, and then you've had leadership roles in colleges and local authorities and in government. So I always think of you as the person who's like inside out and outside in. You've got these different perspectives. So Sue, tell us ever so briefly, you know, about your career, you know, sort of just a few headlines, but particularly, how did you link with Fettle?
Yeah, I'm one of those interesting people that's worked in nearly every sector, but I think Ruth is as well. So we've got like two of them on the call, which is interesting. However, I haven't had that many jobs, which is interesting as well. I like to stay, you know, with my, you know, I'm grounded in the further education world, and I sometimes see myself as gamekeeper turned poacher. Or I sometimes see myself, you know, am I an educator or an administrator? And I think they are the sort of themes of my career. In the job I'm in now is sort of made for me because I'm allowed to be that advocate for the adult learner. I feel I need to be that voice. I need to be that champion. And I think that ability to speak up only comes with maturity. However, I'm absolutely overawed by the young people of the world who see themselves as activists. And when one introduced me recently and said I was an activist, I so loved it. So that's my new world. But I'm an activist who loves a good system. Really, you know, I can't think of anything better when a plan comes to implementation. And my own doctorate was in how, you know, bureaucracy can actually support innovation. So that's my career in a nutshell. Yeah. And it's been like this amazing sort of organisation there when we probably needed the most. Because in the last 5 years, there has been a sort of vacuum of thinking. And what, you know, why I wanted to join this webinar, you know, the space to think and to think differently and to think with others is incredibly important. And again, you know, I've learned that we need more of that. We need more of that space. And my work with Fettle, you know, the Fettle has commissioned some really good pieces of work in the world of adult education. They've helped us rethink basic skills now to take it on to 2031. They filled a huge data gap. You know, we collect a lot of data, but we don't interrogate it. And it's made us think about adult community education probably in a different way. And without Fettle, I don't think we will be, would we be as confident about the future as we are? So I know Ruth is sort of nodding there, but you know, I'd like to just thank her really. Without her thought, you know, her hindsight and future gazing, we wouldn't be in this strong place we are now.
That's fantastic to hear, you know, about that space for thinking that Fettle here in the UK created, that actually no other organisation had that. So when you think about this leadership of thinking, what comes into your mind on that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting and hard question. And it's like, it's different in different places. So when you're a college leader, when you're a principal or chief exec, you know, something Ruth said at the start really struck a chord with me. You learn as much from your staff. Your staff know what's right for the student. You have to listen, you have to take it on board, but then you do need everybody to share the same values. And that only comes from thinking about what those values are, sharing them, discussing them, and then believing in them. But now in the job I'm in now, you know, I'm in a place where I want to influence more. I want to rechange the thinking. It has to be, you need to do that in a different way. And you don't always have to wait for government. And I think that's one of the things that we spend too much time doing, is looking for government, looking for the next FE white paper, looking for them to form a solution. Where actually, if they give us the parameters and a bit of money, We can just get on, but we need to think more about how we need to move the system on. And the thing that I absolutely love is to start a conversation, and often, quite a difficult one. You can push it, push the conversation and be that sort of disruptive person in a meeting and nobody actually really wants you there. And then people say, well, actually, I've not thought about it in that way. And then the power and the harnessing of those intellectual brains is probably far more superior to mine. And then we get, an end product that is absolutely fantastic. And that becomes from their thinking process. And although Zoom is brilliant, I still think you can only do that in a room, big room. Yeah, it's all right.
But I think this is one of the great things, both of Fettel and Sue, what you've said, which is, if we don't unsettle ourselves, in our thinking, then actually we just really plod along and maybe feel disgruntled with government policies, and policy making is often so messy. What advice would you give, to others keen to influence governments? We've got people here from all over the world. What advice would you give them? Because you've been on the inside, you've seen many people pitch up with the great ideas and enthusiasm. What would you say they should do?
Well, you have to be canny, right? You have to, read a few of the books that our politicians have written, and you can see what influenced them. But the first and easiest thing is to always find a hook. So manifestos are really important. Once you've got something in a manifesto, you're on a journey. You've got a hook. So that's the first thing. Don't forget about the evidence. We've been talking about evidence-based policy for ages, right? Don't forget about the evidence. Do have it. Do have the economic benefits of what you want, but don't forget the emotion. Bit what Chris was saying, don't forget the emotion. The impact on voters and the learner story, never underestimate it, because that is what actually makes most politicians in the end tick. And then don't assume that, what you're talking about, government actually understands. It might be obvious to you. You might be, your professional way of thinking. It might not be the people in government's way. So you need to be in it for the long game, and you really need to be also, you need to pounce on opportunity as well, which is sort of an interesting balance. And the thing that I've seen, I've gone into rooms with quite cynical politicians, and they've been met by sort of passionate, enthusiastic people, and they've been swayed. So don't forget that, if you are passionate about something, and always give praise. If something's turned up and has worked for you and they've changed something or another, then praise may be, at a really great level. You must never underestimate it.
Great. And just final quick yes or no answer. Do you think the further education sector needs an independent think tank going forward?
Absolutely. I've got no issue with that. I mean, we need that space. We need to challenge ourselves, and we need to move out of our little bubble sometime and get more interaction like what you're doing today, Deirdre, which is brilliant.
Fantastic, thank you. Well, we're up against time as always on these conversations. The hour always goes by so quickly. So I want to now very briefly introduce Matt. And again, well, there's a little quick poll there, Mark. Let's have a look at the poll just while I introduce Matt. Maybe our colleagues could fill out. Do you think we need an independent think tank for the further education sector? Matt is the MD of FE Associates, a specialist provider of recruitment, consultancy and development services. Again, you can see on our website his wonderful biography. And when I looked at your biography, Matt, I was sort of again thinking about, you kind of worked your way up the ranks, and then you've actually done some of the really, really hard stuff, around organizational turnaround and recovery. And then you've kind of jumped out almost to bring in the next generation of leaders. So it's fantastic that you're here. What do you think, Matt? Do you think we need an independent think tank for the FE sector?
Unquestionably, and I think that Fettel has demonstrated just how important the leadership of thinking is to the sector. We need to have intellectual curiosity promoted and pursued. we need things challenging, we need things questioning, we need things reframing. And actually, things need picking up and taking apart when they're live and when they're happening and when they are real. And actually, for me, this notion of the leadership of thinking, it means, I would say it's poking and prodding through provocation. And of course, that's one of the things that we know Fettle has done very well in terms of its provocation. And of course, I think the reason we need that think tank is to inform the future. And I'm always intrigued by this notion of the future, because people address it as if it's a thing that's going to happen, you know, in a long time. But actually, the future is in a minute, it's in an hour, it's in a day. So that informing the future is really, really important. And you know, one of the things I wanted to talk about is the best way to inform the future for the sector. And I want to really make a case for thinking differently about leadership development and the way we develop our leaders, because actually the world is so different, you know, moving from pandemic to post-pandemic, even though post-pandemic seems like a long way off, actually, when you think about what's happening globally. Leadership is different. We're in disconnected organizations where remote working has become the norm. We know that our people need something else from us as leaders. Never before has the notion of duty of care been so important to us as leaders and as employers. Therefore, we need to think differently, I suppose, about our leadership practice. And when we're looking at how we develop leaders in today's world, of course, we're in this really weird context, which is full of contradictions, because we've got lots of complexity, we've got lots of fear, but we've also got lots of opportunity as well. And actually, when you look at how we develop leaders in most sectors, it's not just further education and skills, but models of leadership development haven't actually really developed or altered much. And I consider myself to be overtrained but underdeveloped. And I think that's a feature of training in our sector and many other sectors. So, you know, traditional common leadership development programs, very similar in their approach. They tend to be skill-based. They tend to focus on the kind of leaders others want us to be, and they seek to build this kind of leadership competency and expertise. But they really miss the person at the center, the leader themselves and the people they lead, their followers. And they tend to overlook the highly complex human elements and the systemic factors which drive behavior and I suppose shape the ways of working. So effectively, I'm calling for us to rethink the way that we develop our leaders. And this is very much based on I think, really unique experience that I had with Fettle through a program that was run back in 2015. I was principal and chief executive of Bath College, and I was invited by Fettle to take part in what I consider to be a groundbreaking piece of work, which was run by Gabriella Brown and David Armstrong from Working Well. And the whole premise of the program was to look at how psychoanalysis and systems theory contribute to the leadership of thinking in the FE and skills sector. And essentially, the program took a number of sector leaders through a series of strategic seminars which focused on systems theory. And it actually got us to look very, very closely at factors impacting on the practice of leadership and workplace behaviors. So things like love, things like attachment, presence, compulsion, persecution, loss, aggression, and even Oedipal relationships. And if you think about some of these things, when you're looking at things like compulsion in leadership, you're really looking at what are the things that are driving people to continue making the same mistakes. When you look at things like loss, you're actually looking at the relationship between change and why people are resistant to change. Of course, it's about loss. And also there's something about how we as leaders attach ourselves to our organizations. So really this was kind of groundbreaking stuff to start thinking about these psychoanalytic concepts and systems thinking in our leadership was really groundbreaking. And I think essentially the program and its focus was really about carefully cultivating our own inner worlds, as well as remembering those of others. So for me, this kind of approach was both revolutionary and revelatory as well. And at this point, I'd been in my leadership career for about 20 years. And I can honestly say that whilst I thought I understood myself as a leader, I didn't. And whilst I thought I understood others, I actually didn't until completing this program. And actually, for me, the program came at a really interesting time because I'd recently merged two organizations together. And I was kind of really struggling with all of the issues associated with bringing the two organizations together, you know, shaping strategies, aligning cultures, building a sustainable business model. And now I look back on it, I know that I was not comfortable with the situation at all as a leader. And actually during the program, I actually resigned from my job, woke up one morning, put the letter in, no plan, no job to go to. Now, when I look back on it and really understand what was going on, when you look at things like attachment theory, I realized that I had no personal attachment or love for this new organization that had been created from the merger of these two organizations. And actually my sense of loss was for my old world in my old organization. And of course, it took me, you know, the experience of going through this program to really understand the impact of these things on my leadership and on the behaviors of others. But what it's really taught me as a leader, and I think what we as leaders need to ask is one simple question. And that question is, what's really going on here? So when people are behaving in a certain way that we may not like, ask the question, what's really going on here? When you've got a peer who isn't communicating really well, ask that question, what's going on here? And when you're having difficult relationships with stakeholders or partners, ask that question, what's really going on here? So essentially, Deirdre, I'm making this case for rethinking leadership development to move to a situation where the centrality of people is put at the heart of leadership development. We are a people sector. You know, that's what we are. We're reliant on people to be fantastic, and we need to do fantastic things for the people that we are in service to. So there are loads of interactions at play between leaders and followers and external partners. So we need to develop our staff and we need to set them up to think about leadership in a very different way.
Oh, thank you so much for that, Matt. I've been scribbling down lots and lots of notes. There's so much, the poking and the prodding, really, really important, and overtrained and underdeveloped. I think I'm in that category as well. There are some questions, and we probably are going to run out of time to be able to answer all the questions, but one is in relation to the psychoanalyst research, and FETL have got some publications, Ruth, that people will be able to hopefully maybe learn a bit more about the Working Well programme, for example, that introduced that, and maybe in the whole education sector we need to have more of that. A quick question for Matt: how does FE do this sort of new way of leadership in the future through models of governance to encourage more ethical excellence rather than targets and you know, all the pressures of KPIs? Have you got a wisdom?
Yeah, in very my one line answer, if you like, is, and I am a governor at a college as well, so seeing it through that lens, I think being really focused on purpose. You know, the purpose of the organization, what it's there to do, who it's there to serve. I think purpose is key to that, to answering that question, Deirdre.
Great. Now, well, let's all remember that purpose. I want to just finish now by coming back to Ruth on any sort of final reflections. Ruth, we're just so honoured to have so many talented speakers today. We could have had a 2-hour session. So Ruth, just a final point from you, and then I'll get Mark to show the final slide so that people can see where they can get some great resources.
Okay, can you hear me? I'm switched
yes.
on. I mean, just to say, this needs stating because it's easy to forget it. The reason for access to thinking and good thinking, thinking well with others, is so that you do things better in service to the learners. And I think always remember this notion of think and speak about it. The real task of leadership is to win hearts. And, you know, you can't buy a heart or instruct a heart. You win it by the way you are as a leader, the way you take up your role. I mean, Sue gave us some very helpful tips on how to talk so politicians will listen, and listen so politicians will talk. So, I mean, it's not thinking for thinking's sake, it's thinking to be in useful service with others for the advantage of other people.
And I think I would certainly say that, you know, when we think about how people make decisions, do they do it with their hands? Do they do it with their heads? Or do they do it with their hearts? And, you know, we know it's a combination of all three, but often it's none of those three. It's the stomach. It's what you feel in your gut that travels up your body. So, you know, just that's a food for thought. Look, thank you so much to all of our speakers. You've been absolutely amazing. I hope that colleagues who've joined us today have found it as inspiring as indeed I have. Mark, if you could just show our final slide just so that we can help people see where they can get some practical resources, that would be terrific. So I will, of course, say go to the Fettle website. There's a whole host of publications. 42 project grants were issued, 82 publications, 84 videos, 9 webinars, 12 large-scale symposiums. There are some leadership books here that I've found quite useful. I've got one beside me called Dare to Lead, which is good, but you know, it's not just about reading the books, it's actually putting the ideas into action. But I hope that you'll find these helpful. And really just to say our next webinar is in May. It's on our next slide. And I should also just mention the book about rebel talent. That's a really interesting one because it talks about sheeple. You know, are we sheeple? Are we the followers, or indeed do we actually set the trend? And Ruth always talks about we're here to create a future that we won't see in the long term. So thank you so much to Ruth, thank you to Fettle, thank you to our speakers, and in particular Chris gets the prize for being up at 7:30 in the morning. Save the date for our next webinar, which is on decent work, inclusion and sustainability. We've got a special issue from the British Journal for Guidance and Counselling, and I'm going to be joined by some speakers who'll actually talk about what does that mean in the aftermath of COVID. So thank you so much to everyone. I really enjoyed your company and I wish we had more time. Do come along again, and I hope that we have slightly unsettled you, but also excited you for the possibility of the thinking of leadership in the years ahead. Thank you so much.